Welcome to the Stories of School Leadership podcast, the podcast where we elevate the voices of and create connections between inspirational leaders from the UK and around the world. I'm Emma Lurie, and thank you for joining me as I share these journeys, inspirations, and stories of education, leadership, and life. In this episode, I'm joined by Keith Bates, who is an associate trainer for Adele Bates Education and a behaviour consultant. And he shares his journey through education and into teaching and leadership. And he explores his role and the reflections on his time as head teacher of a residential special school. We talk a lot about relational practice and approaches, and we dig into current pedagogy and curriculum and how this links to some of the behaviours that we are seeing in classrooms across the country and in the work that Keith and Adele do around supporting schools with behaviour. So I hope you find this one really interesting. Let's get going. Hi, Keith. It's so fantastic to have you with me. Thank you for giving up a little bit of your time to share a bit about yourself and your journey. It would be lovely to know, I guess, who you are, where you are in the world at the moment, and what your current job role is.
Right. Okay. Well, it's lovely for you to have me on as well. I'm really pleased to join you. So yes, I'm Keith Bates. In terms of where I am, you might be able to tell from my accent roughly where I might be. I now live in Barry in Wales, in South Wales. Um, but I've only just moved back to Barry. I spent the last 20 years living and working in Norfolk, so come back to my roots. Current role. I'm now a behaviour consultant, set up a consultancy business on my move back to Wales, and particularly I work as an associate trainer with Adele Bates Education. Adele, many people may have heard of, national behaviour specialist and author and speaker. So that's what I do.
Amazing, thank you. And I think the themes of behaviour and some of the challenge that we're seeing in schools at the moment, I'm so keen to get your insight a bit later on because I think that will be really helpful. But let's go a little bit back. I'm such a nosy person. I really like to know about people's own school experiences and what their kind of journey through the education landscape was. So what was school like for you? Where did you go? How was
So
it?
well, I suppose the bit that's a little bit different in one sense is that I worked out many years ago. I worked out that between reception and year four, or what is now reception and year four, wasn't called that when I was in school. It was a long time ago. Um, but between those years, I changed school every year. I literally went to a different school every year between reception and year four. The reason being is my parents pretty much we kind of almost, it wasn't quite every year, but I moved from South Wales to Norfolk back and forth a couple of times because my dad was a mature student and also went into teaching as a late comer to the profession, and that basically meant we moved back and forth across the country several times. Um, so I had a very disrupted early education, and definitely, I mean, in terms of, I think the impact, I think it wasn't so much just, it definitely compounded difficulties I still have around kind of um, change and moving from one place to another. You'd think with that many moves I'd get used to it, but I don't feel, my recollection of it is I never got used to it. Um, once we then, by the time I got into year four, I think it was year four, um, we settled in Norfolk. I ended up then staying in Norwich all the way through the rest of my education. So, high school, I went to one high school from beginning to end. Um, in terms of my memories of it, it was all right. It was okay. I didn't love school. I didn't hate school. Um, I wasn't. I was pretty successful, by most, by depends on how you define it academically and things like that. I didn't struggle with school, um, and I had some, I developed friendships that I still have today. I'm still friendly with a number of people from school, even though it was back in the 80s I went to high school. So that's and those elements of it weren't particularly difficult for me. I think the thing I do often say to people about my own experience at school and maybe how it informed some things later on is I was bored a lot. I did school was all right, but I didn't um, I couldn't see the point of a lot of it. And so I always, from quite an early stage of my teaching career, I think I understood those kids um, who I understood those kids who just, were not that bothered about doing the work, were not that engaged, that kind of thing. Um, and I still remember, sitting there working out the probability of a wet Monday in maths when I was in high school and turning around to my mate next to me and saying, I can really see this coming in useful in a job interview that I can tell you what the probability is of a wet Monday. I kind of have a different perspective now about the validity of learning these things, but that was very much me, and I was always I remember again having a conversation with a friend saying I always did just enough to get to do the next thing. So I did well enough in my O levels because I'm old enough that I was the last year group that did O levels, and I did just enough to get to do my E levels. I did enough in my E levels to get to university, and more to the point, a university I wanted to go to, but I was not exactly an overachiever. Let's put it that way. So there we are. That's a very kind of brief history of my education. It wasn't like a massive thing for me.
It's fascinating to hear those threads because they're things we hear currently. And I guess we will
Yeah,
maybe always hear those things around
yeah,
questioning why. I mean, with
yeah,
the curriculum and assessment review going on at the moment, questioning why children do they need to learn these things? Why do they? And
yeah,
for young people, I guess what you've touched upon there is that value of young people as best we can need to understand why they're learning those things. It would be helpful if we knew why they were learning them sometimes. I
yeah.
guess that brings up a little bit of a question sometimes,
For
doesn't
me,
it, around
for me, a lot of it is about understanding why children are often not as engaged in their learning as we are and
mm,
we want them to be. I think some teachers particularly struggle with that. If they may have come through an experience of education where they loved it, and you get people who always wanted to be a teacher or absolutely loved their subject area and things like that, and passionate and loved it and loved it, and so find it very difficult to then relate to children why they don't share that enthusiasm.
mm.
I never had difficulty understanding why they didn't share the enthusiasm um, that I might have, and so it made it a lot easier for me to kind of alter what I was doing to try and make it more relevant and more engaging for them, by and large. But I always think it's really important, and this is, I know we're getting straight into behaviour here, but it's about understanding rightly or wrongly, this is how many kids feel sitting in our lessons, in our classrooms. That's how they feel. That's what we've got to work with. So we've got to work from this. And one of my mantras in life in general, in all sorts of aspects of work, is we have to meet people where they are, not where we want them to be. And children are often not where we want them to be in terms of their value on learning. And I've never found that as difficult as maybe some people do,
Yeah.
because I'm a bit like that myself.
And that's part of it, isn't it? It's that the ability to have had an experience or a range of experiences that give you the ability to then sit in their shoes a little, or stand in their shoes a little bit better.
Yeah,
And I think you're right that, and we will, I'm sure, dig into this more because there are deep links there between the behaviours of our young people and how connected they feel, but also what you've touched upon there is that disconnect between what the teacher feels should be happening and what the young people want to be happening or feel should be happening, and how we bring those two together. You did and I just want to hear a little bit about how you kind of got into education. So you touched upon a little bit there about your early experiences of teaching. What made you then want to go into it? You said your
yeah,
dad was went into teaching.
yeah. But again, I was I wasn't sort of somebody. I went through university thinking, what the hell am I going to do when I leave? Because I didn't really have a clear plan, and teaching wasn't really part of that. Um, I wasn't really sure, and there was when I graduated, I had this vague idea that I quite found I harbored the dream of working in the music industry in some way because I'm a huge music fan. Um, and the closest I got to that was working in Our Price Records in Lincoln, which is where I moved to after I graduated. And needless to say, that wasn't exactly the beating heart of the music industry. Um, so I sort of I didn't really see a way into it from there. I'm thinking, what am I going to do? And it was a bit, I did different jobs. And my partner of the time was training to teach as a primary teacher. Um, and there was a scheme and this is how it basically happened. I was living in Lincoln and I was on the dole for a while. And there was a scheme at the time, this is the early 90s, called employment training. A bit like YTS, as people who go that far back. Employment training, where basically you got an extra tenner a week on your dole money to go and do really a work placement, you would call it. Um, and I, there was some placements on offer in a primary school, a local primary school in Lincoln. And I thought, yeah, I'll give that a go. And it was a bit of me that was starting to think, do I want to look at this? And I thought, well, I tell you what, for an extra tenner a week, I can go and see what I like it, whether I like it. And it was a primary school in Lincoln, so I went, and he worked there full time. It was absolute, disgrace, really. You worked there full time. You worked there it was like being a full time TA. We got paid tenner a week for it, um, and um, and I went and did it. And fundamentally, I really enjoyed it very quickly. I loved it. And probably crucially, the head teacher of that school told my supervisor who came in to check how I was doing, sort of like, "Oh, he's a natural," is what was said. Which and it wasn't actually very often in my life I'd ever heard that I was natural at anything. I was never particularly natural, but I did enjoy it. I really liked it, and I thought, okay, yeah, let's do it. But I knew that I didn't want to necessarily be a primary teacher, so I applied to do PGCE down at Bath University, and started a PGCE, and that was sort of how I got into it, really. And I remember having a conversation with my then partner before I started the PGCE of, I want to be really good at this. I remember that really. I somewhat spent much of my school time, my education time, including university, being a bit of a not an overachiever, just getting by, and then there was a bit of sort of bumming around different jobs, thinking, what am I going to do? And there was a bit of I wanted to do something which I thought I really want to work at this and get good at it. And I remember saying that. And dare I say, that was it. That was 30 years ago. So
Wow. And I guess it's that passion of finding the thing that lights you up and, and
yeah,
you enjoy and wanting to do that really well is incredible. So
yeah,
what were your first, I mean, you talked a little bit about your perception, I suppose, of being able to understand your students because you didn't want them to be bored, you wanted them to be engaged. What other experiences did you have when you started working in education, and I guess, what were your steps into leadership? What were kind of those routes that you thought, okay, I'm doing this bit. What's the
yeah,
next step
yeah.
in terms of into leadership?
So that stuff I remember really vividly. I often tell this story. Um, I don't know when I'm doing training and things like that. I've told this story in various sort of venues, which is I remember my first teaching practice in a comprehensive, mainstream secondary school in Trowbridge in Wiltshire. Um, you know, as has been a feature of my career, really white working class, low aspirations. It was that kind of demographic. And I remember starting my first teaching practice, and within I slightly had an image before I got going. I was thinking, oh, this will be like Goodwill Hunting. It'll be kids carrying me out on their shoulders, and they'll be standing on the tables, captain, my captain, and all of this kind of stuff. And then within about 2 weeks of my first teaching practice in Trowbridge, I remember thinking, oh, they don't want to do the work. Oh, oh, they really, they're not interested in doing the work. And it served me really well, that epiphany, because it's something I've never, you know, I, 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 I kind of, I kind of observed it, understood it, and to an extent accepted it from a very early stage in my career. Um, and so it's not about low aspirations or expectations for children, because I'm sure we might come to some of that. But there was a realism I had from very early on, and I knew by the end of my PGC, by the time I qualified, I remember those particularly your first teaching job. I remember having an interview for my first teaching job, and you'd often get asked the question, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" That question we all get. And I remember being really categorical at that point too, because you can't say, I don't know, really. You can't say
On
that.
a beach in Bali.
Yeah. I don't know. I might not be in teaching.
Yeah.
You've got to sort of say, look like, you've got a plan and look like you have a level of ambition. But I remember saying, and it was the truth, quite categorically, 5 years time, I want to be ahead of you. I knew by the time I qualified that pastoral stuff was the route I wanted to go. I was not particularly interested in becoming a head of department or anything like that, and I wanted to be ahead of you. And being a form tutor I loved it. I loved it from the get-go. I never resented it. And teaching from the word go. I always described that I'm a history teacher by training. I always used to say to people, for me, history was just a vehicle that allowed me to teach to an extent. I didn't really care what I taught. And I've gone on to teach many other things. There is an element of, from quite early on, I wasn't, I like history, obviously, and I can be passionate about certain bits, but I always got that bit of kids not sharing, the interest in it that I might have. And certainly, so I understood that. And there was an element of that was a bit me, that I was actually just using history as a vehicle to teach. And it was the teaching, it was the working with kids that fired me up. And actually, it was the pastoral stuff that fired me up the most. So I knew that from a really early stage. And then I managed it, because within 5 years, I became a head of year in Bristol, which was still, um, one of the most challenging and rewarding things I have ever done in 30 years of teaching. It was an incredibly challenging school, incredibly challenging role, and that was my first significant middle management role. And then from there, I did that for a few years, and then I moved back to Norfolk. And when I moved back to Norfolk, that was actually my first move into senior leadership. So I was actually a senior leader. I ended up moving into senior leadership after about 8 years of teaching, something like that. It was about 8 years of teaching. So I was a bit of certainly within secondary education at that time, I was a bit of a rapid riser, but then there was an element of, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this. I kind of knew I'd done it quite quickly, and I was still quite young, so I made deliberate decisions to not just keep going up and up and up, and I didn't become a head for a long time after that. But that's probably jumping ahead a bit, really.
Well, no, it's so fascinating to hear how that worked for you, and that what really struck me when you were talking, and you touched on it before, is that idea that you understood how they feel, and instead of just clashing against them, going, we've got to
Yeah,
learn,
yeah,
this is
yeah,
really
yeah,
exciting and interesting, you found ways to do it that interested them. And that that idea of wanting to teach, but because we're in a time at the moment where the curriculum is hugely knowledge heavy, and has
yeah,
scrutiny at the moment, but this idea that we can teach without necessarily having to, not that we're not going to worry about the content is important, but I sometimes talk to people and we say that we overly worried about the content, whereas if we are just thinking about the value of teaching young people, giving them opportunities to develop reflective thinking, relationships, and then being able to talk to one another, oracy practices, that is that not more important? That kind of sounds like
right.
you were signaling to.
Yeah. I mean, and I'll be careful not to get on a huge hobby horse here. because it is one of my hobby horses, is that I think for a start off, I mean, the period of time I'm talking about was to kind of at the turn of the millennium, really. That was when I kind of moved from my first teaching job into middle management and then into senior management. So it's over 20 years ago now. And I do think whilst, there was content and there was curriculum and there was a lot of talk then that, it was getting heavier and heavier. The themes of conversations haven't changed in 30 years of education, as far as I'm concerned. But my own experience was that there was a greater capacity to do what you needed to do in order to engage children. And I think and the hobby horse for me, and I do think it's been incredibly damaging in education in our country, particularly in the last 10 years or so. And I think is one of the factors of why behaviour has become more challenging is that, and again, I'm going to probably offend a few people when I say this, but I'll say it, is that I think there is a misnomer that children can be children with, behavioural challenges to us, that they can be engaged and their behaviour can be changed through the curriculum. And if you've got a brilliant curriculum that is well taught, pedagogically sound, all of those kind of buzzword things, that that is what will sort behaviour. And so actually curriculum and pedagogy has become this panacea for all our ills in education. And funnily enough, it's not working. It's not working, certainly from a behaviour perspective. It's not working. And I think part of it is not enough people are willing to stand up and say, maybe curriculum isn't the answer. My perspective is relationships are the answer, and you can still deliver a robust, challenging, engaging curriculum and do it well pedagogically. But if you haven't got the relationships underpinning it, it won't work. So I think it's not just about content as you describe it, Emma. It's also about the belief of what curriculum can deliver for us. I think we've been led down a bit of a garden path about that in the last 10 years. There we go. That's my hobby horse.
No, it's a good hobby horse. Well, let's keep going on this idea a little bit more, and I guess you might want to share along the way how what your leadership, your journey in terms of the way you did things, maybe. So tell me a bit more about relational approaches, I guess, and practices and the impact that has if you're marrying that together with, as you said, strong pedagogical approaches and a good curriculum. What is that other side then of things that can make a difference for our young people? And yeah, some of your own leadership experience, I guess, because I think you've done it.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a massive question, really. I mean, probably we need to preface it by obviously making it clear that when I did eventually get to headship, and of my 30 years of teaching, 15 years of it has been working in a residential SEMH special school in Norfolk, and 8 years of that 15, I was the head teacher of it. So a huge chunk of my educational career now has been in special ed and complex SEMH special ed. Now, the reality is that I sometimes people treat behaviour and SEMH as if it's this separate skill set to how we work with and teach all children, and in the way, I don't know, maybe I'm not at all experienced or knowledgeable about EAL teaching, and I would imagine there's a lot of stuff there that you really need to know that you do with EAL students that is different to non-EAL students. I passionately believe that is not the case with SEMH children. With SEMH, what you're talking about is that the stuff that is good for those children works for them educationally and socially. The things that work for them are the same things that work for all children. The difference is number one, you have to do those things more intensively depending on their level of SEMH needs. Um, yes, you have to more consciously do it more intensely. And more to the point, for most children, the absence of that stuff that's good stuff will not necessarily prevent those children from learning because they've got other things that will allow them to learn and to engage in education, partly about aspirations and a value in what they can get out of education. But actually, when it comes down to it, you know, good relationships and engaging curriculum that is taught well is good for those children. It's also good for SEMH children. Um, and so the the kind of basis of many years of my career, and certainly the work I do now and the work I do with Adele now, is out of that understanding that relational based education is not in some way a contradiction or mutually exclusive to curriculum and pedagogy. It's about understanding of that, that's good for everybody. So we need to do it, we need to develop that skill because it'll be good for everybody. And for those children that challenge us, you won't get anywhere without it. And that's really kind of if I can virtually encapsulate what I do, Adele does, that's what it's about, really. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think it does. And I love how you have really clearly stated that because, again, with some of the challenges that we have currently in the country, we are seeing this, huge challenges with schools who are trying to have inclusive practice and, incorporate a range of different things within their schools that will meet the needs of all. But increasingly, we are seeing more and more young people really struggling with behavior, but behavior that underlying signals, additional need, additional challenges. I do think there's questions about if we delivered things differently, if we had a different approach, how many children would present in that way? Because we're in a state, certainly in terms of the experience I have working with schools, where lots of our more primary experience is very formalized, and for our young people, that's really challenging. They're really having to. It's very adult directed for a large amount of their day, and it's not necessarily working for big amounts of our children. Then we're seeing lots of children in schools who are either school refusers or their classroom refusers. So they're running the halls because they're not wanting to be in class. And what we're asking schools to do is a bit like you said, is separate it out. Go, this is what you need to do for the children with SEMH need, and then this is what you do for everybody else. But you're so right. What if we looked at it from an approach about, well, actually, you're right. All of this stuff is great for all of our young people. Why are we not giving it to both? I had a conversation with somebody the other day around I think it was about a sensory breaks for a child. Well, that one child is showing us with their behavior that they really, really, like you said, with the absence of sensory breaks, they are not able to function in the classroom. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of other children in that class that could really do with that, but for whatever reason, they're not showing it in that way.
Yeah.
And I
think, I think, you were just, we were talking about you were saying about formalized primary teaching. I think this is where I really struggle with a lot of the way that curriculum and pedagogy and the way it's developed in the last 10 years, particularly, is that there's become this thing of this is the way to deliver this is the way to deliver that. And of course, people will reference the research that proves that and all of those things. But my experience is that there is no one right way for everybody to do, to teach. There is no one way. And actually, I'll give you an example. When I first started teaching in the residential SEMH school I ended up working in for a long time, there was a teacher there that was, dare I say it, a good old-fashioned EBD teacher, a man she ran a tight ship. It was incredible. You'd walk in and the kids were sat there, individual desks facing her, and it was, you were not, it was the boundaries were very, very tight, to the extent of children would be picked up if they were to turn their head and look at their partner. Forget about saying anything. Forget about, throwing anything or stuff like that. There was this element that her expectation was that, if they turned their head, they'd be picked up for that in some way. The boundaries were very, very tight. And actually, most of the time, it worked for her because the kids, knew exactly how it worked in her room. They knew how it worked, and most of the time they would work within those boundaries. And I remember going to watch her teach. I'm thinking that's amazing, but I remember thinking equally, I can't do that. That's not the kind of classroom I want. And so nobody's going to tell me that that's how I had to do it. The bit for me is that my belief is that kids, to an extent, don't really care how you teach something. They don't care whether it's very formalized. They don't care whether it's group work. They don't care if it's whatever the pedagogical approach is. They don't really care. They will engage in it if they know that your approach is coming from a place of care. And dare I say it, coming from a place of love. And actually those people who teach in a more formalized way, that might work really, really well for them because the kids know that yes, they're a bit formalized and yes, they're a bit inverted commas strict, but it comes from a place of love and care. Equally, somebody who has a more informal way of doing it and is a bit more off the cuff and is a bit more, interactive or whatever, whichever way it is of doing it, if they know that they are safe and secure in there, they will be able to engage in that style as well. And so, I think again, it's one of the ways in which our emphasis on curriculum and pedagogy has been quite damaging because I think what we've done is we've, and it varies, doesn't it? But I am absolutely aware of particularly some multi-academy trusts, for instance, that have a pedagogical approach to teaching, phonics, for instance, and everybody has to do it exactly like that because the research says if you don't do it like that, it's not as effective. But that's in an environment where all things are equal and the children are fundamentally all ready to be engaged in their learning. Those children who are not, if that doesn't work for them, or it's not coming from a place of authenticity and humanity and care, it's not coming from those places, they will not engage in it and they will start to present behavior that challenges us. So, for me, the common factor across all styles of teaching, all pedagogical approaches, our different ways of doing things. But the common factor is if it doesn't come from care and love, kids will be less likely to respond to it. Certainly those children that present challenging behavior will be much less likely to respond to it.
Yeah. You've said this phrase a lot, and I think you mentioned it when we spoke before, and I wanted to, I guess, unpick it a little bit more. You use the phrase, but when children present behavior that challenges us.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit more about that because I really like that phrase.
Yeah. So there's an element of that is, that is, the kind of the politically correct phrase these days. So there's definitely the world of behaviour and SEMH, and those people who live in this world a bit will be very familiar with us. That we try to move away from the language of challenge, even something like challenging behaviour, or certainly naughty behaviour, but challenging behaviour. The idea of behaviour that challenges us is an understanding of that a lot of behaviour that we see in schools. It's the effect on us as the adults that's challenging about it. There's many children presenting those behaviours don't find it challenging at all. They find it's as easy as breathing. So there is an element of, rather than sort of saying you're doing this, it's more kind of rephrasing the language to say this is the effect that it's having on us. And so the reason I kind of quite like the phrase, I don't mind. I don't get in a massive tiz about the language in the way that some people do. I have to say, somebody says difficult behaviour, challenging behaviour. I don't start lining people up against the wall about it. We've all used these phrases, um, and it is difficult behaviour and it is challenging behaviour, let's be honest. But the reason I quite like the behaviour that challenges, and certainly the use of that challenge, is when you use phrases like difficult, certainly if you're using phrases like disruptive, or worse still, naughty. The problem is with phrases like that, difficult, naughty, disruptive, is they're incredibly subjective. Disruptive is one of those phrases that we have to be more specific about it. Disruptive to whom, and in what way. And also people tend to use it really quite as an umbrella term of they're being disruptive. And you're just thinking, well, they're kind of not really. They're being disruptive to you. The rest of the class actually haven't even noticed it sometimes. I mean, very often they do, but often they don't. Whereas behaviour that challenges us is saying exactly what it is. It is, and that's not to say it's unimportant. We need to work with it, because we can't be working in an environment where there's behaviour that challenges us left, right, and centre. So I think it's a kind of win-win term, really, in terms of its specificity.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. So I'd love to go back a little bit to your experience of headship and what that
Yeah,
was like. Yeah, tell me a bit more about what it was like to lead a school.
yeah. So um, I, to an extent, I never thought I'd become head. I was one of those senior leaders that never thought I'd become a head, and I did for a period. So I had two stints in the residential school I worked in, and I actually, after about 7 years of working there, I left very much as a career decision of I need to get back into mainstream, because otherwise I'm going to end up really losing touch with mainstream education. So I went back into senior leadership in mainstream for a couple of years. And at that point, I thought this is as far as I'll ever get, really, because what I knew I didn't want, and I still feel like this, is I didn't want to be a head of a mainstream high school. I've seen that job up close, and I made a decision of that the work-life balance. I always described headship, particularly of a bigger school, it's completely a lifestyle choice. Your life is no longer your own, and I mean right in the middle of the summer. I remember working with one head in a mainstream school when I was still in mainstream, and he spent 2 weeks of his summer holidays trying to work out what to do about the RE teacher they hired, whose work visa from Canada had not come through, so he had no permission to work. And suddenly and sorting that out was 2 weeks of his holiday gone, and he had all the parish council meetings. I mean, forget about just governors and parents' evenings and all of those things, but he had to go to the local parish council meetings as a pillar of the society and stuff like that. And I just thought, I'm not prepared to make that much of a lifestyle choice. So I felt like that. But I did say, after working in my school for 7 years, I said the only school I might become head of is that school. And then, somewhat coincidentally, I've been back in mainstream for a couple of years, and the headship of the school came up, and I thought this probably would be the only chance I would get to run that school. And I thought, I don't want to at least not try, and I went for it, and I got it. So I ended up being the head of it, and it still ended up being a fair lifestyle choice, to be honest. But I mean, I will always. I mean, that I didn't stop that long ago. I ended up, when I did it for 8 years, and then I became director of inclusion for our multi academy trust, which is 18 schools. And I knew I was moving back to Wales this year, and I thought this will be a good sort of step away, give me a few more options and all of those things. And get me back into mainstream again a bit. So I did that for 2 years, and now I'm doing consultancy work. I will always say that, I knew the day I left headship of that school, nothing but nothing would ever top it professionally. And I will say, no matter what else I ever was to do, nothing will top being the head of that school. It's the greatest privilege of my professional career, and it means more to me than any other job I've ever done or will ever do. So on that level, I loved it. I loved it, and I loved the school deeply. So I loved it, and I was very, committed to it on every level, really. Um, and yeah, and I made a bit of a commitment to people afterwards, which I think will probably hold true, that I would never be the head of another school. So headship for me was really very much about that school. It was about that school. Like, it wasn't this great thing about sort of running schools more generally, but within it, of course, I just got so much opportunity and experience and so many other things. Because one of the things I did for 3 years while I was the head of the school was I ended up being the chair of the Norfolk Association of Special School Heads. That kind of and that was a fascinating. That gave me a huge insight into um, the work of special schools more generally, not just SEMH ones, but looking at the kind of complex needs of it. Hugely enhanced my understanding of special education and other areas of SEN, but also because you worked a lot in that role with the local authority, and it gave me huge opportunities to really understand the relationship between schools and local authority, and probably subsequently one of my calling cards is I tend to have a greater perspective than a lot of people do on what the LAs are trying to do, what special schools are trying to do, but also the mainstream sector are trying to do. And so that period of headship, I think, set me up really, really well for what I do now, because I think one of the problems, I'm going to go off on another hobby horse, one of the big problems I think we have in education is it has become incredibly adversarial in this country, with schools blaming LAs blaming schools, parents blaming schools and LAs, schools blaming parents, mainstream schools, feeling there's not enough special school capacity, special schools feeling mainstream schools need to be more inclusive. It's kind of everybody thinks the other parts of the system are not doing a good enough job. And because of some of the roles I've done and the kind of school I led, I feel I've got a great kind of understanding of everybody's perspective on it. And the trick of it, is somehow being able to find the common ground between actually, how do we compromise what each of us wants for our particular part of the system, and bit of give and take to make the system work better for everybody. Not perfectly, because it's never going to work perfectly, but make it work better. And I think that's what I tried to do a lot in the last few years, is kind of talk to different parts of the system and work with different parts of the system to understand the other parts of the system, so that we're working a bit more together and a little less adversarially, which is what I think has become a real feature of our system in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
There we go. That's another one of my hobby horses.
Your hobby horses are great. They're very
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I'd love to hear a bit more about is I guess probably your learnings and the inspiration that you had. And it's so beautiful to hear you speak about your leadership of that
Yeah.
in that way, because there's so many leaders who go, oh my gosh, it was really horrific and hard. I mean, a lot of, if you're going to be a head, you've got to love the job, because you're like, it is a lifestyle choice. And loads of leaders out there adore their schools and their communities, but that doesn't come without big challenge. So it's so lovely to hear that. I guess, like you said, you're now working in this space where you have a really great range of knowledge. You are seeing, working with schools on the ground, you're seeing what's happening. What things have you taken from your work in the SMH sector, I guess, that I say we in terms of like mainstream,
Yeah.
are there some key things that you end up talking about a lot? We've touched on, I guess, relational approaches and that love and care, but are there any other ideas that are coming up a lot for you that you feel we need to be doing more on in thinking a bit more from that SEMH towards mainstream?
Yeah, so you're right to say, the relational approach and all of those things is probably the underpinning of a lot of it. There's the bit I mentioned earlier as well about not seeing children's, children with behaviour that challenges as some alien set of children where you do it completely differently. The basic principles of what works with children works with SEMH children. You just have to do it a lot more and a lot more intensively. So I think there's that element of it. I think that this is much more the case in high schools and secondary education than it is in primary, but I think most people listening to this podcast will know that the move towards very kind of centralized systems of responding to children's behaviors, and these convoluted systems and structures that we have of how to manage children's behaviors have not been good. And actually, in the same way that curriculum and pedagogy is not the panacea, having a really tight system of how we respond to children's behavior is not the panacea either. And actually, being prepared to flex those systems and structures, I believe we have to have them to do, but being responsive to them and being flexible around them, I think is something. And I think it is possible to get the balance of systems and more individualized responses. I think it is possible to get a workable balance of that. And a big part of what myself and Adele do is about a culture in schools of staff buying into that. That the fact that we haven't given that kid a detention for doing such and such, whereas we did with that child, does not mean the end of all. That somehow anarchy is broken out, which is, how some people do see it. That flexibility is a good thing, not something to be ashamed of. So I think that's another area. And then I am one to say the controversial stuff. I think the other area that I think has got to be discussed, and I think it's really got to be discussed in primary education a lot more, which is a really interesting area. We could probably end up spending an hour talking about this, but is the use of physical intervention. And that is something I think that needs a much, much bigger discussion, because it's almost the elephant in the room that all the stats demonstrate it. The biggest reason for permanent exclusion from primary schools is physical aggression. Secondary is very different dynamics, persistent disruptive behaviour, but in primary it will be largely around physical aggression. And we all know that virtually every primary school in the country has got children in it that are on a daily basis running around, putting themselves at risk, putting others at risk, adults and children, damaging property, these kind of things. And it's significant. And I think the elephant in the room is that schools feel unable to be able to stop them in the moment of stopping them and saying, we're not going to do that. We're not going to carry on hurting people. I'm not going to let you do that because you're going to hurt yourself. I'm not going to let you carry on breaking things. And that's not me saying at all that restrictive physical intervention is a panacea either. But I see this quite differently around the country in a way, because the great thing about what I'm doing now is it takes me around the country, and dare I say it, in some parts of the country, I think there's been a really, really in-depth discussion within the system locally about, the use of RPI in mainstream settings. And then you go to other places where it's like, oh my God, no, we do none of that. And there's no, and the result of which is, all the challenges that are putting a huge strain on our system. And I believe very, very strongly that RPI is in no way has to undermine the building of relationships, the therapeutic approaches, the child-centered approaches, all of those things I'm a huge advocate of. I think there are some parts of our system that see RPI as incompatible with those practices. I don't think it has to be. I think it can be, but it doesn't have to be. And I don't think we're having a big enough discussion about it, when actually it's a really important part, I think, of us helping the system feel like it can manage a higher level of needs, which at the moment there are big sections of the primary system particularly just feel they cannot manage these levels of needs. So that's something I would like us to do, but I also understand the sensitivities around it, and it's a very emotive area to talk about. So I do get why it's shied away from. But if we are going to keep more children in mainstream education, which is everybody's aspiration, if we are going to more successfully meet the needs of those children, the use of physical intervention is going to have to be part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And it is in some places, and it's certainly not in other places.
I think
so there we go.
Yeah, really, really important. And it is a challenging conversation to have, because we're working in a time where staff feel very nervous about interactions with young people for a range of things, even from managing behavior. Staff can really shy away from some of that, right down, and then all the way across to needing to use physical intervention. What's your experience been of navigating that parental understanding and knowledge? Because I can see even though you've just shared a snapshot there, that's so important. And while we do want parental engagement in some of our other conversations around curriculum and other, it feels less important. Whereas if we're going to have that big conversation, that's going to have even more challenges with parents, isn't it? Because that's often where the nervousness comes around, is that adults are saying, actually, I don't want to do that because I don't know if, and it's around systems and structures in schools, but I'm interested in what your experience has been of the parental dialogue there.
So I'll speak to that almost purely from the mainstream perspective, because there's no point in talking about it from a special ed perspective, because it is just part of it, particularly in SEMH, it is part of that, and parents, carers kind of know that. So let's talk about it from purely a mainstream perspective. So, I mean, and this is in no way me suggesting I'm fully responsible, but when I was Director of Inclusion for a multi-academy trust, partly, yes, because of my background, we brought in a programme around the use of physical intervention, including restrictive, as well as all the de-escalation and the therapeutic. A fantastic programme in Norfolk that I've been involved in for a long time. And I brought that into our schools, all of the schools, in a much more kind of embedded way. Trained everybody up around the non-restrictive parts of it, as well as the therapeutic de-escalation side of it. All of that was mandatory training for all staff who worked with children in all of the schools. They had to do that bit of it. And then there was a programme of more targeted training for staff who worked around children where there was a foreseeable risk of restrictive physical intervention. And we did, a programme of training across the schools on that. So we spent, it took fully a year to kind of get a lot of that training in there and roll out that programme. In the 2 years I did that role, we didn't have one permanent exclusion from any of the primary schools, and there were 13 primary schools in that trust, and there was no permanent exclusions. And there were lots of reasons why there were no permanent exclusions, including the fantastic leadership of those schools, some fantastic staff, doing all sorts of things, brilliantly and creatively. But one element is that we had a programme where staff felt confident and empowered to be able to stop children doing these things when they needed to be stopped from doing it. Now, part of that rollout, part of that way of working is really talking to parents and carers about what we're doing, making sure that we talk about it with those children that have a foreseeable. We know who the children are. The children with a foreseeable risk of requiring physical intervention. Sit down with the parents before we start having to use it and say, look, we've been trained in it. This is how we do it. We'll show you what we would do, and we put it into the children's risk assessments. We're explicit about it, and we talk and we have a proper systems of recording and reporting of the use of physical intervention. Make sure that's all robust, but it is also alongside the training of staff and the rolling out of that. You do a lot of talking, not to all parents all the time, but just those parents where there is a foreseeable risk, and those parents that we think may well be finding difficulties with it. We're going to really engage with them, and that's what we do, and that's what the schools did. And there were one or two questions inevitably, but what we didn't know, in the time we did, there was no significant challenge to the use of physical intervention in any of the schools because the parents understood, and this is the thing, people, is that actually when parents are sat down with schools and talk to, in a way that shows they care about their children, they understand their children, the vast majority of parents will actually turn around and say, yeah, no, I get it. I know what they do. And I know because they're often doing it at home as well. I know what they do. I've got confidence in you to do what you need to do to keep the situation safe. And there was, relatively speaking, there was very, very little challenge to it. But it's the reason it doesn't work like that in many settings and in many places, it doesn't work like that, is that the use of physical intervention is somewhat done on an ad hoc basis, and it's a reactive measure, and it's a bit ad hoc, and the systems around it are not in place. The engagement with parents and carers hasn't really happened, and that's when parents and carers tend to jump up and down about it, and therefore people get nervous about doing it. What actually I think, my experience is if you do it as a holistic program that is a strategic priority within the schools, and we're going to invest in the time to do it, and we're going to invest in the time to engage the community in it and understand it, and we're going to do it really holistically, then number one, families don't tend to react as badly in any way near as badly as people think. And more to the point, the confidence that it gives to staff has so many knock-on benefits because we're giving them a piece of the toolkit. And people talk about toolkits all the time, but it's such an important part of the toolkit that it allows you to use the other bits of the toolkit, the preventative stuff, the proactive stuff. And I think the problem is if we leave RPI out of the discussion, what the industry, if you like, around SEN and behaviours is it's all about prevention, which we all agree is absolutely what we want. But we've got this problem in our system at the moment that you've got. It's part of the industry is sort of saying, how do we stop children? How do we make it so the children won't want to do these things, or how do we do it so that we teach children not? And I get on. But the lived reality of schools a lot of the time is they don't get the chance to, put that stuff in place and really embed that stuff because they're dealing with the fact the kid is running around smashing the hell out of things and smashing the hell out of people. Mm-hmm. And they're just responding to that with suspension and exclusion. And then nobody likes that. Nobody wants that either. So I think RPI has got to come into the national discussion about it a lot more because I think, the work I've done sort of proves again, it's not binary. It's not this thing of it's either RPI or it's therapeutic ways of working. It's either no RPI or overuse of RPI. There is there is a way to make these things mutually compatible.
And
So
they
yeah,
work together. That's what you're saying, isn't it? You know, we've talked
yeah,
about curriculum, pedagogy, all these things, but what you keep coming back to, and I think you're so right, is that it's got to be underpinned by that love and care.
yeah,
And we're talking, and that's when we're trying to put ourselves in young people's shoes. What do they need? How will they know that we love and care about them? And I know when you spoke a bit, you sort of, I think you used to be like, oh, dare I say love? And I think people are almost a bit nervous to
yeah,
use
yeah,
that word
yeah,
love, but it's so
yeah,
important when our young people know that we care about them. It's a huge shift, isn't it? And like you said as well around parents, if and carers, if parents and carers can understand and deeply know that we care about their young people and we're trying to find ways through, then that really shifts that
yeah.
discussion, doesn't
And,
it? So
and the
important.
vast majority of parents, not just in special ed, in mainstream as well, that I've ever seen and worked with around the use of RPI, the vast majority get it. They get it once they know how it's going to happen, what's the con, and they know it's coming from the right place. And
Actually
and I think,
powerful, you know, in some ways giving them tools as well, and that recognition that if home and school can work together and be
yeah,
offering children similar levels of security in terms of when things get tricky, this
yeah,
is how we're going to keep you safe. That's really powerful.
and and same as we do, they don't want their children constantly being at home because they've been suspended for for an extreme physical outburst. Um, they don't want those things, and I absolutely and I think my experience, what I do know from my experience in complex SEMH is, where high levels of RPI are inevitably used at points, is the kids know, the families know um, that we still care deeply about. We cared enough to stop them.
Mm.
We cared enough to stop them because I do not want to see them get older and do those things and end up in jail because they weren't able to regulate their emotions. And there are some children, particularly at primary age, there's a very different dynamic at secondary age. I get that completely. But in primary age, where actually this is the more significant issue is around physical aggression, that they there is an element of us just showing to children, that just because we've stopped you from doing that does not mean we're bullying or whatever. We cared enough because we want you in the school. We want you to be able to maintain yourself, and we gradually work with you therapeutically and relationally so that you don't need to have your emotions managed. And there is an element with primary children that there are children in our mainstream schools, absolutely, that it's very difficult to emotionally contain them, which we talk a lot about in therapeutic and relational ways of working. That we talk about emotional containment for them. Very difficult to emotionally contain them, make them feel emotionally safe and secure when they can't be physically safe and secure. And sometimes we have to provide the physical safety in order to build the emotional safety. Not with all children by any stretch, but there are children like that. And I don't think we acknowledge that enough. We don't talk about it enough.
Yeah. Keith, I could talk to you all day.
Yeah,
This is
I
fascinating.
talk
Just
too
before we
much.
finish, no, you don't know. It's really, it's so interesting. And I think, you know, you said so many important things during our chat. I'd love to know a little bit more before we finish around the work that you're doing now with Adele and what that looks like in schools, I guess. You know, what does your day look like? What sort of
Yeah,
things do you
yeah.
do? And how
I
can
mean, the work,
people, you know, get in touch with you guys if they'd like to seek
yeah,
some
absolutely.
support?
So, I mean, the work with Adele, I've been working with her now for a few months, is fascinating. Some of the people listening to this will probably know who Adele is. She has written a book called Miss I Don't Give a Shit, which tells you something about the organisation and our ways of working. It's not necessarily conventional. Um, and we kind of do all level of kind of behaviour and SEMH work. I mean, Adele for many years, she's been running her work successfully for several years. Um, Kind of comes at it very much from a classroom practitioner's point of view, and that's what kind of still a bread and butter part of it, of upskilling classroom staff to more effectively understand and respond to behaviour. We do that kind of work. I think that what we're moving into now, particularly with extra capacity, with me coming on board with the organisation, is kind of more long term, real behaviour change work across a school. So rather than just turning up for individual bits of training or individual talks or whatever, doing more kind of ongoing pieces of work, and we're doing a few of those around the country. I tend to do the stuff more in the west and the north of the country. She's doing more in the south and the east of it, but we do work which is about kind of whole school work, and probably bringing me in as well with my leadership background is working with leaders to kind of create behaviour cultures that we want to see in the school. So there's a whole range. I mean, have a look at her website because it's all on there, www.adelebateseducation.co.uk. And it's all there, and she's on LinkedIn and Twitter, and it's not difficult to find. And, it's pretty easy to kind of get a sense of what we do now. And it's great. It's really nice for me because even though I am doing other sort of individual freelance bits of work, I always said when I kind of came on board with Adele, it's really nice to do consultancy work, but do it with somebody.
Yeah.
Because as you know, Emma, it can feel a bit lonely sometimes. But with Adele, it's sort of like feeling like we're both doing this piece of work. But yeah, that's kind of what we do. We do all levels of it.
It sounds fantastic. I've seen Adele speak before.
Yeah.
Right. Amazing. Keith, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. I think it's been really fascinating to hear your experience and your journey. And, I'm really and I feel passionate about it anyway, but I'm just taking away that idea of that consistency. When we talk about consistency, we're talking about consistency of care and love, and that we can change how we do things for individuals. And, hopefully we're coming to a place where things are going to be, things might be reviewed slightly. Hopefully, I don't know. I've got my fingers crossed. I'm feeling hopeful that the pressures will be released a little bit, and our profession can be entrusted to make decisions for our young people, because they're all so unique and they need us to make decisions that meet their needs, like you said at the start, meet them where they are, not where we expect them to be.
Yeah, you don't work in SEMH if you're not an optimist about it. And I always have the feeling of, I've been doing it long enough where people say it's getting worse, and it's getting worse, and in many ways it is, and I share many of the frustrations about it. But with SEMH, you just work with what you've got in front of you, and that's kind of, I still think that's the bit we can all do. We can choose to either rail against the system and be angry with the system, or disengage from the system, or we can just say, I'm going to try and make my little bit of the world a bit better for the kids that I work with, and that's going to be the mantra for me for 30 years. So thank you very much for having me on.
You're so welcome. It's been fantastic to speak to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to the Stories of School Leadership podcast. We'd love to know what inspired you in this episode, so do get in touch and tell us your thoughts. And please share this with friends and colleagues. If you have time, a review would mean so much. It really helps us to reach more people. If you'd like to connect with me to follow my journey or access some support, maybe supervision, coaching, or early years consultancy, you can find me at Stories of School Leadership on Instagram